Hey, and welcome to this lesson where we're going to learn about animating meshes with timelines. By the end of this lesson, you have learnt how you can move meshes with timelines and also how you can add execution pins to timelines by using event tracks. Okay, so when our cannons are firing, we can see that the cannon barrel doesn't actually move. So we're going to make use of a timeline to animate the cannon when it fires. To do this, we're going to animate the relative location of the cannon barrel mesh. Let's go inside the cannon blueprint and inside the viewport for it, and let's select the cannon mesh. We can actually rename this static mesh component to cannon barrel, just to be more consistent there. So remember when we view the transform on the details panel that this isn't the world location. This is showing us the transform relative to the cannon barrel's parent, which is the cannon base. Now let's imagine this barrel animating for a moment. How would we want this to work? Well, we would want to translate the cannon barrel back into the base and then make it come forwards again, giving the effect that it's firing. And as we translate the cannon back and forth, we can see that the Y relative location is changing here. Now, how far back would we want this cannon barrel to go? If we say we want it to come, let's say about this far back, we've got a value of about negative 24 on the Y there. So in my case, I would want the cannon to go from 0, where it starts, to negative 24 to make it go all the way back, and then make it go back to 0 again. And we can actually plot this on a timeline with a float track. We would use the float track to drive the relative location of the cannon barrel's mesh. And it would give us the result that the cannon is animating when it fires. So right now I have a challenge for you. Use the blueprints viewport and move your cannon barrel mesh to find your Y relative location range, just like I did a few moments ago. We can use these values to plot a timeline. So the next part of this challenge will be to create a timeline and plot a float track for translating your cannon barrel mesh. So pause here and give this challenge a go, and then in a moment we can continue on animating our cannon. So looking at my cannon barrel mesh, I wanted to start at 0 for its Y relative location, and then I want it to translate back when it fires to about negative 25 units here, and then translate back to 0 again, giving the effect that it's firing. So I'm going to create a timeline to do this. Inside my event graph, next to my spawn actor node here, I'm just going to right click and scroll all the way down to the bottom and add a timeline. I'm going to call this cannon fire timeline. And inside this timeline, I'm going to create a new float track, and this can be called cannon barrel location. And I need to decide the timeline length. So how fast do I want this whole animation of firing the cannon to be? Well, I want it to go pretty fast, so I'm going to set the timeline length to about 0.8 seconds. Now, I want it to start at 0, so I'm going to add one keyframe, set the time to 0, and the value to 0. And then we want to translate it to about negative 25 units on the Y. So I'm going to plot a new keyframe, and the time is going to be in the middle of our timeline. So that this is going to be 0.4 seconds, and the value is going to be negative 25. And then we want it to come back up again to 0 at the end of the timeline. So 0.8 seconds for the time here, and the value will be 0. And we can use these arrows here to see the whole timeline. We just click on these to fit the timeline vertically here. So this represents our cannon barrel at its starting location and then translating back and then going back to its starting position, giving us the effect that it will be firing. Now let's come back to the event graph. And let's grab the cannon barrel from the Components tab. We want to update its relative location. So we're going to drag out the reference that we've just placed on our graph here, and we're going to call the set relative location function. We can split the vector to gain direct access to the Y location value, and we can plug our timeline track straight into this. And then we also want to connect the update from the timeline to the set relative location function. Now we have a problem here when we want to execute and play our timeline because the spawn actor node that spawns the projectile is looping back to our delay. But we want to play the timeline immediately after our spawn actor node fires, but we also want to retain our looping behavior back to the delay here. And none of the timeline outputs will help us here because the update output is going to continuously fire and the finished output only fires when the timeline finishes. We really need an output execution pin for when this timeline starts, and I'm going to challenge you to create this. We've been using a float track up to now on our timelines. However, there's other types of tracks you can create. So your challenge right now is to create a new timeline track that we haven't used yet. I want you to create an event track inside your timeline, and I want you to name the track Cannon Fired. This will create an output execution pin on our timeline. And to make it fire at the start of the timeline, add a single keyframe at 0 seconds. So pause here and create your event track in your timeline, and then come back to the lesson and we can continue on. Okay, so we want to create an event track for our timeline. To do this, we can enter the timeline and we can add an event track by hitting this button in the top left with the exclamation mark on it. So this adds an event track for us. So this event track is going to fire when the timeline starts, and the timeline starts when the cannon fires. So we're going to name this track Cannon Fired. If we come back to the event graph, we can see now that our timeline has an extra execution pin now. However, this execution pin isn't going to fire because we have no keyframes on our track. We want it to fire when the timeline starts. Let's add a single keyframe. We can hold down left shift and left click to add a keyframe, and we can set this time for this keyframe to be 0. And we don't need to really worry about the value here because the execution pin doesn't return any value. So this is meaningless. We can just set this to 0. And this is all we need to do here. Let's come back to the event graph. When our timeline now plays, our cannon fired output execution pin will fire. Okay, we can actually take this and connect it to this reroute node, and we want our spawn actor to execute the timeline. And we want our timeline to play from the beginning every time it's fired. So let's connect this to the play from start, not the play. We want it connected to play from start. We can add another reroute node if we want, just by double clicking on the wire here, just to make it a bit neater. Okay, great. So let's come back to our level and let's hit simulate. And we should see now that our cannons are animating while they fire. We can probably speed up the animation here. So let's come back to the blueprint. Let's come into the timeline. Now let's make our timeline shorter. Let's change the length of it from 0.8 to 0.4. And the middle keyframe here for when we change the location of the barrel, let's make this time 0.2, and we'll make the final keyframe 0.4. So that's going to speed it up for us now. And now if we come back to our level and simulate, we can see that the animation is just a bit quicker for us now. So our cannon is almost there, we have it animating, and we can control the speed of the animation by making adjustments to its timeline. Now the blueprint for the cannon is starting to get a bit more complex, so in the next lesson we're going to tidy it up, and we're also going to implement a way for the projectiles to damage the player. So we'll be tackling all of this in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome to this lesson, which is all about damage functions and events. By the end of this lesson, you have learnt how to use Unreal's damage system. You will learn how to implement functions to apply damage to actors, and also how to execute events once an actor has been damaged. Okay, so I'm just going to start this lesson off by cleaning up the code for our cannon blueprint before we move on to damaging the player. So looking at the start of our code here, we have the event begin play that connects to a delay. Now, we don't really need to encapsulate this down to a function or anything because it's quite clear what it's doing. It's processing the cannon's fire rate. But there's something else to be said here. Even if we wanted to collapse this down to a function, we actually can't do this because functions cannot contain any latent nodes. Basically, anything that delays or takes time to complete. And this is why we cannot encapsulate timelines or delays. So let's move on to our spawn actor code here where we spawn our projectile. We can encapsulate all of this into a function. Let's select all the nodes here and right click and collapse it down to a function, and let's name this spawn projectile. Now I'm just going to move the timeline next to it just to make it more tidy here. And now we have this set relative location. It looks like our reroute node is going a bit crazy. Let's just remove all of these out for the time being. We'll clean these up in a second. Now from our timeline, we go to this set relative location function for our cannon barrel mesh. So this is updating the cannon barrel's location. Let's right click on this and collapse this down to a function, and let's name this move cannon barrel. And it's not giving us a very good parameter name for our input parameter here. We could just rename this to cannon barrel Y location. And now with our cannon fired output on the timeline, we can click and drag this back to the delay here. And we can double click on the wire it creates just to create a simple reroute node there. So that's looking a bit more tidy now and easier to read. So now let's move on to making the projectiles cause damage to the player. Let's close and save our cannon blueprint, and let's head over to our projectile blueprint. The only code that we have in our projectile blueprint is this event hit and destroy actor function. Currently, when the projectile hits anything, it will remove itself from the game. Now we want to make it so if the projectile hits anything, it will apply damage to whatever it hits and then remove itself from the game. And what we really want out of this is to make it so if our projectiles hit the player, they will cause a damage event to fire on the player pawn blueprint, and then we can use this event to restart the level. Basically just like what happens when the player falls off the map. Now Unreal already has a very powerful damage system with functions and events for dealing with damage. We can call functions to apply damage to actors, and these functions contain parameters for who caused damage and how much damage we want to apply. And we can implement events for when actors receive damage, and these events return how much damage is being applied and also who is causing the damage. So looking at applying damage, there's a few functions we can use, and there's many parameters involved for each one. Now our player pawn doesn't have any health. We're not going to need all of these extra parameters on these functions. We just want a very simplified damage system. So we're going to just use the function named apply damage. And even with this function, there's quite a lot of noise with it, but we don't have to use every pin here. Let's just focus on using the damaged actor and base damage pins. So when using this function, we can apply damage to an actor. We have an input pin for who is going to be damaged. And we can decide how much damage we want to apply. And that's all we need to worry about right now. So we can call this apply damage function to cause damage to an actor, but what does this really do? Well, any blueprint actor can implement events for dealing with damage. If an actor is damaged and has this event included on the graph in their blueprint, this event will execute. So we can implement this event any damage into the player pawn to find out when the player has taken any sort of damage. So I've just shown you the functions and events for dealing with damage, and now I'm going to challenge you to implement these yourself. I want you to implement the apply damage function in your projectile blueprint, and with this function, apply damage to the actor that's returned on the event hit. Then inside your player pawn, implement the event any damage anywhere in the player pawn's event graph. So I encourage you to pause here and take your time to explore through the functions and events dealing with damage, and then just give it a go, and in a few moments I'll be taking you through the process. So just pause here for now and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so in our projectile blueprint, we want to call the apply damage function. We can bring up the action menu and we can come down to the game category and we can enter the damage subcategory here. And the first function is the apply damage function that we want to use. So let's grab this function and let's add it between our two nodes here. We can hold down left alt and left click on an execution pin to break it. And we can just move the destroy actor across and insert the apply damage function between these. And let's just hook up the execution pins. Now, who do we want to apply damage to? We have this damaged actor input pin here. Well, the event hit returns the actor that was hit. This is what this other pin is here. We can drag this straight into the damaged actor pin. For right now, I'm not going to worry about any of these additional pins. I'm going to head straight over to my player pawn blueprint. Now let's call the event any damage. We can right click anywhere in our event graph, and we can come to the add event, and then we can come to game, and then damage, and then event any damage. So this event will fire anytime this actor is referenced in the apply damage function. So how do we know if this works? Well, let's just use a simple print string now to print out a message saying player pawn damaged. Okay, now let's close this blueprint, and then let's just spawn the player here and move in front of one of these projectiles, and let's see if we get this print string message up. Okay, so we don't have any message coming up yet, but all the code is correctly implemented apart from one thing on the projectile. We haven't provided a base damage value. If it stays at 0, it means that it's not going to apply any damage at all. So the event any damage will never fire. Let's just put in a value of 1. Now we're not going to use any of these values at all. This is just to make sure that the event fires. Let's close out of this, and let's play from here again, and let's see what happens now. So we are now getting our print string messages saying that the player has been damaged. So it's important to note that you need to make sure you use a value other than 0 for applying damage. So we have an event for when the player gets damaged. In the next lesson, we're going to use this event to restart the level when the player is damaged. But we also want to avoid any repeating code. So we're going to be tackling all of this in the next lesson.